All right, well, we've got, it looks like 200 folks logged on at the moment. I know we may have some more joining us. So as they make their way into the webinar with us, I'm going to get started. My first thing is to say hello, good morning. Meg Ryan here with the League of Cities and Towns. And we are very, very, very pleased to be here sponsoring this today with Utah APA, the American chapter of the Planning Association here in Utah. And we also want to thank Susie Prethram and Judy Piquel for their behind the scenes work in getting this organized. We are here today to launch into the first bit of the legislative land use recap from the session. And we will do introductions in a minute. I wanted to go over some housekeeping items for today. We do have quite a few folks. We will be going through a PowerPoint slide. We are going to ask you to use the chat box for questions, and we will take questions throughout, but we will pause after each of the major bills and try to answer your questions if we haven't already in the chat box. You'll also notice in the chat box, we have quite a few supporting documents. We've done a PDF of the slideshow that you will be seeing today. We have a summary of all the land use bills in 2 parts. We did the top 3 that we believe are sort of the most pressing and important in the first summary, and then we have the rest of the bills in a second summary. We also have a detailed bill, a bill review of the noticing provisions for the clerks. So we'll be reminding you that throughout, but please look at the first item in the chat box that has those links for you to download. And we will also have those available for you on the ULCT website, as well as the APA website after this session. We'll have a recording and all the supporting materials. So with that, I want to, again, say welcome. For those of you that have logged on, please use the chat box. Thank you for being here. We appreciate the effort of our partners in this. And let's see, I want to just start by a quick poll so you guys can know who's out there in the Netherlands with you. We have about 240 folks registered. So let us know where you're from, city staff, county staff, private sector. We'll give you a chance to know who else is on the call, and hopefully through the chat, you'll also be able to network and see who's on here today with you. So I'll give this just a few more minutes. We're getting, looks like a lot of city folks, which is great. Those are our peeps. And let's see. All right, I am going to end this now. We'll just share the result. So hopefully you can all see that. And we've got city staff, elected officials, city attorneys, some private sector. Nobody loves land use. Well, that's sad. I do. I should have answered that. All right, I'd like to turn it over now before we get started to my boss and one of the tireless advocates for cities in this legislative session. I think if you ever had to step in his shoes for a day up there, you'd be really happy. You're a planner or whatever other profession that you have. But Cameron would like to say a few words before we get started. Cameron?
Thank you, Meg, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this Wednesday webinar about what happened during the 2021 legislative session. Meg said she was pleased to have everyone join us. I'm even more pleased that the session is over. It felt like the 2021 session didn't actually start in January because the 2020 session never actually ended. We, for those of you who remember pre-pandemic, the legislative session ended the day that then Governor Herbert announced the first direction and directive about COVID-19, and then we were off and running with multiple special sessions, several of which included land use related legislation, and that all finally came to a close a couple of weeks ago with the end of the 2021 legislative session. All in all, from a local government perspective, it was a pretty good session. There were multiple major victories for local government. We feel very good about where we ended up in the public safety space, for example. There were more bills actually this year. Fun fact, I know people are here for land use, but I think it's important to know that there were more bills passed this year around police issues and community trust in police than there were in the previous 9 years combined. But those were all bills that we had worked on proactively and felt good about the ultimate outcomes on those bills. There were a bunch of bills that did not pass in the land use space because of your efforts and because of our collective advocacy. And those bills ranged from land use preemptions on billboards to preemptions or restrictions on development fees. There was legislation about permitting. There were bills that were in concept form but never made it to the floor because of our pushback. So there was certainly a lot of legislation in the land use space this year, some of which will result in a lot of changes at City Hall. We acknowledge that, and that'll be part of our conversation with our board and our members in the weeks and months to come in anticipation of 2022. But we appreciate your good work in making sure that cities are compliant with state law, but that also that cities and those of you in the private sector and counties and districts elsewhere are all in this together, ensuring smart growth, smart land use, and ensuring the quality of life of our collective constituents. Meg Ryan loves to say that everything is about land use in local government, and quality of life really does come back to land use. So thank you for all of the great work you're doing. The other thing I just want to reference is that the types of bills that we're seeing in Utah are not unique to Utah. In fact, the Arizona legislature right now is considering a bill that's very similar to House Bill 98, except it has 7-day timeframes for plan review. And there are other bills around the country in this space. So when I talk to my fellow league directors in other countries, they're facing the same legislative stresses, whether it's around short-term rental preemptions, fees, or other things. So again, all in all, totality of the circumstances, we feel pretty good about the legislative session, but we recognize it's going to continue to be, land use will continue to be a primary tension point and primary focus in the months to come. So with that being said, we welcome you to this Wednesday web chat, and we also invite you or your colleagues at City Hall to join us for the next 3 Wednesday web chats. We'll be doing one next week on transportation and economic development because there was a flurry of bills in that space. The following week will be on elections and the census and bills in that space. And then the final week on April 14th will be on public safety. Then we'll have our mid-year conference in sunny St. George the following week. I was in St. George just a couple of days ago for the Chiefs of Police Association conference. The weather was perfect, and I've made the request to ensure that the weather be perfect for our mid-year conference. Then in May, APA will have another in-depth session on land use. So we're doing our best to make sure you have the materials that you need. Our cheat sheets and wrap-up will be coming soon. They are at our graphic designer now putting that all together. So thank you to our team for your work at the Capitol. Thank you to you for your advocacy and for your work at City Hall. And I want to introduce now Angela Price, who, in addition to just being an all-around awesome person, is the APA Legislative Co-Chair, but also the Project and Policy Manager for Community and Neighborhoods in the capital city of Salt Lake. So Angela and team, take it away.
Thanks, Cam. I appreciate that. It's so good to be here with you all today. And I have the utmost faith and confidence that there's a new dawn, a new day ahead of us. We're all 265 or I guess 275 of us can be together in person soon. So again, happy to be here today and with my partner in crime, Wilf Summercorn. We both are co-chairs of the APA Utah Chapter Legislative Committee. And I think it's fair to say that this session was one for the record books. I know Wilf has been doing this for a lot longer than I have, so he'll have lots of his hot takes there. There were a lot of land use bills this year. My day job is tracking land use and housing and transportation and engineering building bills, and we were very busy in Salt Lake City this session. I want to just give a huge shout out to the league staff. I know I don't think that Cameron, Victoria, Carson, Wayne, those guys slept at all during this session. They were in the trenches every night negotiating. HB 82, HB 98, billboards, really fighting for local control and turning what started off as really bad bills into bills that are a little bit challenging to swallow, but in such a better place than they were. So when you see your favorite local league staff, give them a safe social distance high five, buy them lunch, and thank them for all of their tireless work, because they were absolutely in the trenches for us this year. So thank you guys so much for all of your work, and hopefully you can eventually get some sleep again. With that, we're doing our update a little bit different this year than we've done it in years past. We are going to focus really heavily on these three bills, the hot takes from the session. And the reason that we're doing that is because these have really profound impacts on cities, and specifically planning and building divisions. And they go into effect very soon. So we want to really dive into these bills in detail. We do have several other bills that we're going to be going over today if time permits. And then, as Cam said, we also have the league conference at the end of April. And then APA Utah is going to be doing another legislative update on May 13th with a deep dive into these three bills and really giving you guys the tools on how to implement them. And then we're going to be doing a Telling Your Story event on May 14th. And at the end of the presentation, there'll be information on those events for you to take a look at. So with that, Meg, feel free to kick it to the next slide. So the first bill that we're going to be talking about today is HB 82, Single Family Housing Modifications. This is Representative Ray Ward's internal ADU bill. And what this bill does is it defines what an internal accessory dwelling unit is within LUDMA. And that definition states that an internal ADU or IADU exists within the primary dwelling unit. It's owner occupied, it's rented for more than 30 days, and it's within a residential zone. It also strikes unrelated within the single family unit definition. I think this is going to be really interesting to see how this impacts cities over the next few years of changing that language within the definition. I know within Salt Lake City, we had some concerns of how that may impact our ability or an individual's ability to rent their home. So I'm looking forward to hearing feedback on how that plays out within different cities and the housing stock that we're trying to push. The big crux of this bill is essentially it makes internal ADUs a permitted use within residential zones. And I'm going to get into the nuances of that here in a minute. But that was one of the big sticking points of this bill. Is it started off that internal ADUs were allowed in every single residential zone, and the league worked really diligently on negotiating that to allow for cities to set that designation within 25 or 60% of the city. And again, I'll get into that here in a second, into those nuances. It also allows a city to be able to record a notice on a property that there's an internal ADU. And that notice for any internal ADU that's developed after October 1st will allow you to be able to regulate short-term rentals. This is important, and again, kind of one of the nuances that was happening behind the scenes and the negotiations that the league was working on with this bill was, if you remember a few years ago, there was a bill passed that essentially prohibits cities from being able to regulate short-term rentals by using sites like VRBO or Craigslist. With this bill, what we were able to do through negotiations is add a provision into that section of code that allows for cities to again regulate just internal ADUs. So those are defined within that section of state statute, and it allows cities to regulate short-term rentals through online advertising. The other, I think, really great thing that happened is it opened up that conversation and that dialogue again. And cities, those resort communities like Park City, for example, who are losing copious amounts of revenue from these short-term rentals and the inability to regulate them, are also struggling with affordable housing stock within their city. And so I know Victoria at the end is going to go into what issues we're going to be looking at in the interim, but this certainly has opened up that conversation, which hadn't been on the table before. So while 82 had some challenging pieces, I think it was good in the sense that it really started a deep conversation about housing within the state, about short-term rentals and the impacts that those are having on our communities. So certainly more to come there. The other piece that's really important is this bill sets up a process for notice of violation and an appeal process. So I encourage you to make sure that you take a look at those provisions within the code, specifically flagging that for your code enforcement folks, to make sure that you guys are following that process, whether it's within code enforcement, business licensing, or both. It also sets up a loan program for internal ADUs. And this is a 2-year pilot program that is for low income, 80% AMI or below individuals to be able to get a loan at a low interest fixed rate to be able to develop an internal ADU. And then the last piece is it changed some provisions of the building code of the IBC that basically would exempt internal ADUs from air discharge, electrical disconnects, fire separation, and window egress. And again, the intent here with Representative Ward was to make internal ADUs something that anybody can do easily, that it's not an expensive option for the homeowner, but then also that it provides more housing options at an affordable level to, again, address that gap that we're seeing throughout Utah and to build up our housing stock. So with that, Meg, do you want to go to the next slide, please? Thank you. As I stated, there are provisions within the bill that are required, and then there are some that are optional. So first off, internal ADUs are permitted use in primarily residential zones. Now the caveat to that, and what the league was really successful in negotiating for us, is that you can opt out of 25% of your residential zones. So you can either say we want internal ADUs to be permitted throughout our entire city, or you can pull back that 25% and say these specific areas, this doesn't fit with the character of the neighborhood. Or
Angela, can I add just one piece there on the
yeah.
5%? It's the 25% of the area that's zoned residential, not the zones themselves. So it's not like you count the zones, it's the area that's zoned residential.
Thanks for that clarification. And then 67% for college towns. So if you have a 10,000 population college town or college university, then you're able to use that 67% threshold. What it does do is it prohibits you from regulating the minimum size of an ADU, internal ADU, the lot area, or the frontage requirements. And in my previous life, I was a planner in Taylorsville. So for example, the Taylorsville ADU ordinance has provisions where I want to say it was 860 square feet that the internal ADU couldn't exceed, and that it couldn't be on a lot smaller than, I want to say, 8,000. And so those types of provisions, if those are within your current ADU ordinance, you would have to modify your ordinance to make sure that you meet these requirements here. I also want to point out that you still are allowed to regulate external ADUs. This bill only speaks to those internal ADUs. So some cities call those guest houses or external ADUs. So you're still able to regulate those as they are within your code. The other piece is it doesn't allow HOAs to prohibit internal ADUs within their HOA association. You may restrict internal ADUs on lots under 6,000 square feet, and that does not, and correct me if I'm wrong, Victoria or Cam, that does not play into these 25 or 67% thresholds. It does allow you to regulate some design standards, and again, the league has put together numerous handouts on this that I see have been posted in the chat, so you can take a look at that. But some of those things are you can prohibit the ability to have a separate meter. One of the big things that the league throughout this session did polling on, one of the biggest concerns with this bill was the inability to regulate parking. And so they were able to successfully negotiate that you can require a parking stall you can require that this is a primary dwelling unit. And again, the ability to have a business license. So you can track the internal ADUs within your city, you can generate the revenue from that, and then you're also able to report that within your moderate income housing report that you submit to DWS if you're one of those 82 cities. With that, Meg, can you go to the next slide, please?
I certainly can, but I'm thinking that I may just interrupt you right now before we go further, because there's a couple of clarification questions that might be useful.
Okay.
So the first one, again, to reiterate to everybody, just the slides are in the chat, but we will have these posted on the APA and ULCT website. But first we got a question, Angela, about what's the difference between an internal and an external ADU? So maybe just clarify that right off the bat.
Yeah, so part of this bill is defining what an internal ADU is. So I encourage you to take a look at that definition, but an internal ADU would be within the primary resident. So within the house, where an external ADU would be, detached from the house. So it could be in the backyard. Some cities allow them in garages. Some cities call them tiny homes or guest houses. So this is an internal ADU that's within the home that doesn't change the primary structure of the home.
Great, and a follow-up to that is the question I've gotten quite a bit is, so what if someone wants to just do an addition to their home and that addition fits within the zoning setbacks that are already allowed? Is that okay?
I believe so under this. I'll tag anybody else and if they have a different interpretation of that, but yeah, I would think that yes, it would fit within those parameters.
Okay, and then we had, what if the owner lives in the internal accessory dwelling unit and rents the main house as a short-term rental? And we can get into that maybe at the end. So, and we will get to some of these other questions. I'll let you keep going on and then we'll field the rest of these questions.
Okay, Victoria turned her mic on. So were you going to add something there, V?
No, I was going to agree with you, Angela. As long as the addition is within, the parameters already set for the home, they could remodel and have that IADU.
Yeah. Okay, Meg, next slide, please. So what we did here is we tried to break down for you what actions you need to take within your city to be in compliance with this. So first off, I want to point out that there are two kind of different trigger dates for this bill. So the first is October 1st. So by October 1st, you need to either say, we're going to permit internal ADUs throughout our entire city, or we're going to trigger that 25 or 67% threshold. Now, if you decide, I know, being a practicing planner, like there's never enough time in the day to just get through the land use applications, and having to do code updates to comply with state statute is always a challenge, in addition to the code updates that you're getting from land use applications. So know that if you don't meet that October 1st deadline, that internal ADUs will be permitted within all residential zones. You can go back and designate areas within your city at a later date, but anything that was permitted between that October 1st date and when you implement that those changes are permitted in their legal internal ADUs. So within a city, you're going to have to make those judgment calls on what areas you want to designate or not designate, and if you want to have them be a permitted use throughout the entire city, and if you want to meet this October 1st deadline. The other piece of this is the single family definition changes on May 5th. So again, that will impact how you deal with code enforcement and how you deal with business licensing. So make sure that you guys are diving into those pieces sooner rather than later and working through that within your code, within your business licensing and code enforcement departments or divisions within your respective city. This impacts all the cities and towns. So this isn't just the 82 that are impacted by SB 34, for example. This impacts every city and town throughout the state. And as you'll see, this requires both legislative and administrative action. So making sure that you are, updating your definitions, that your design standards jive with what's outlined in here, and then designating those areas within your city. Meg, any questions there, or do you want me to move on to 98?
I think we have a slew of questions. This is the fun part, interpreting what this actually means. So let me take these kind of one by one, and hopefully these will feed off. So anyone feel free to jump in on there. So let's see. Let's take the first one. We answered in the chat. Thank you, Victoria, for those of you looking about the sizing. But let's say, is this for single family HOAs? What about townhomes or condo developments? And as my understanding, the language says that it's predominantly and a zone that has predominantly single family. Is that correct, Victoria? How do you want to? So I mean, this is just within an area of your zoning district that has predominantly the majority of a single family use. So it could be a mixed use zone, right?
So the definition of IADU includes primary dwelling, which says a single family dwelling that is detached and occupied by the primary residential owner. So I'm not sure that a townhome would necessarily be included in that. So you need to look at the definition of IADU to see what type of dwelling, but then you look to where IADUs are permitted use. And the bill says that an area zoned primarily for residential use. So this is not defined in the bill. And we had a lot of discussion with the representative about mixed use communities. And it's really going to be up to the city to decide which of their areas are zoned primarily for residential use. So that doesn't mean that there might not be some other uses, but you need to determine what parts of your city are zoned primarily for residential use.
I would, just to add on to that too, I would say part of that determination and designation would be within your own zoning ordinance and looking at the definitions that you have for those specific zoning districts. That would probably help illuminate, what for a mixed use zone, for example, like maybe your zoning ordinance says your mixed use zones are 70% commercial and 30% residential. I think then you would work with your city attorney on interpreting, if you're in compliance or not. But I would start by looking at your specific zoning district definitions within your land use code.
If I can chime in here real quick too. I mean, this is one of the issues that we get when we negotiate bills on the fly. And I'm not criticizing what happened, particularly on the part of the league and their staff and as they negotiated this, but that's why it's helpful to discuss and negotiate these things before the session even gets started. The definitions are not real definite. And what that means is that based on a bill that was passed a couple of years ago in the legislature about plain language, if you have some dispute over what exactly that means, and you look at some of these definitions we've just been talking about, and they're not exact, they leave some interpretation in there. If it's not real plain and real clear, and if a reasonable person can look at it and interpret it in different ways, then according to the plain language part of the code now, it says that you go with what the property owner wants.
Excellent. All right. And we're sifting through them here. Here we go. Can an internal ADU have a separate exit to the outside? Can the ADU be totally separated from the main dwelling? In other words, an internal ADU does not have to have access from within the primary dwelling. Who dares to take that one? My answer would be yes, you can do that.
Yeah, internal ADUs, an accessory dwelling unit usually means it does have a separate entrance. So I'd say, yeah, it's fine to have a separate entrance. You may be able, because there is a provision in there that says that you can't modify or substantially alter the look of a single family residence. You may be able to put some restrictions or some guidelines on there about what the entrance needs to look like. But I think it can have a separate entrance.
Okay, and then we had a question about business licensing. What's that for? So this just allows you the ability to charge that if they are doing some kind of a rental and you want to require that, correct?
That's correct. Yeah. And you'd have to have that spelled out within your code and obviously follow. You couldn't just put an arbitrary fee on it. You'd have to have the fee tied to, a fee study, but a lot of cities regulate rentals, so they know what rentals they have within the city. Obviously it generates revenue as well. And then, as I mentioned, going through your reporting and understanding kind of what your housing needs are within your city, I think this is going to be the intent behind this bill. And I saw a question pop up, is this going to help with affordable housing? That's certainly the intent, right? Is to, we're running out of land. And so how do we get more housing stock? And so the intent behind this certainly is to have more affordable housing. And I think it'll be really interesting to see the cities that track this, if they have a substantial increase in their number of ADUs. I know within Salt Lake City, we allow ADUs and we have maybe 20-ish a year. We don't have a ton within our city that are legal anyway. So I think it'll be really interesting to see from a business licensing perspective, if we see a huge uptick in the numbers of these. And from an affordability perspective for those 82 cities that report to DWS on their housing studies, if this has an impact over the next few years.
And thank you all who are helping us, our League Army, answering the questions in the chat box as we go. We're as strong as your knowledge, so thank you. As you can see, we're generating a lot of interest in this, and we'll try to also gather these questions and maybe do like a FAQ after this and try to publish that out for you. I think the big elephant in the room, and I'm just going to tackle it now from Polly, is how does this relate to short-term rentals? And I don't know who wants to be brave enough to take that one, but so Victoria, maybe do you want to, and I know it was discussed a lot, the interrelationship with short-term and this long-term owner occupancy, so.
So one of the issues we raised with Representative Ward is under current state law, a city cannot look at advertisements for a short-term rental to then go in and enforce an ordinance on short-term rentals against the owner. And we pointed out to him that while he's trying to create IADUs, some homeowners may use this bill, which is requiring cities to allow IADUs as a permitted use to actually create short-term rentals. And short-term rentals, as Angela's pointed out, are actually not helpful to our housing crisis. They create more problems. And so the bill basically says that if you are someone who goes in and gets licensed your IADU so that you have this unit within your primary dwelling where you are living, and then you go and advertise it as a short-term rental, now the city can enforce its short-term rental ordinances against you. That was to try and balance, what the legislature sees short-term rentals very much as a property right, but they also want to deal with the housing problem. We're expecting during interim an ongoing conversation about short-term rentals. I mean, one of the good things that came about this bill is a better understanding, I think, up on the Hill of the problems that short-term rentals create in our housing stock. And we're looking forward to more discussions about how to balance this property rights interest versus the housing challenges we're trying to tackle.
I think there was also a question about what if the owner can live in the IADU and then rent out the main part of the house on a short-term basis. I don't think I saw anything in the bill that would prohibit that. All of the language that I saw addresses the IADU, but not the main structure. So did you see something different in that, Victoria?
No, I did not. And I don't think that's a scenario we thought of working on the bill. So that's probably something we need to keep looking at.
Okay, and then another maybe general question is just a clarification. On the slides, we talked about prohibiting the minimum size of the lot area. So can we clarify the 6,000 foot, the and I'm gonna try to just go back to that slide if I can. The 6,000 foot, where is it? We have it here. May prohibit under lots under 6,000 square feet. Can we clarify that? We have some questions there on what that means.
Yeah, so what, and I was just looking at the exact language in the bill. So regarding the 6,000 feet, it says prohibit the creation of an internal ADU if the lot containing the primary dwelling is 6,000 square feet or less in size. So that's one of those optional things that you can trigger. And then let me just scroll up and read the exact language for the other piece. Sorry, if one of you guys finds it before me, please feel free to shout it out. Okay, here we go. Except as per, a municipality may not establish any restrictions or requirements for the construction or use of one internal ADU within a primary dwelling, including a restriction or requirement governing the size of the internal ADU in relation to the primary dwelling, total lot size, or street frontage. So I can see where that's a little bit confusing, where it's saying, well, we can't regulate this, but we can. And V, I don't know if you want to add some background on the negotiation that happened around that 6,000 square feet. But essentially how it started off was that you couldn't regulate them at all. And the lot area, when they were negotiating that 25 and 67%, one of the things that came up is these really small lots. Do we have to allow internal ADUs on small lots? And that's where the 6,000 square foot figure came up. But I certainly can see where there's some nuance there and some confusion. V, I don't know if you want to add any more context to that than what I just shared.
No, I think you accurately described it. The idea is that some of these really smaller lots, as you know, we're trying to come up with alternative, community plans, that a really small lot, maybe the city shouldn't necessarily have to allow the IADU on that particular size of lot.
Okay, and let's see, we have some comments there. I think some of the things when you talk about the options that you can do, like parking or others. So the negotiation, and Cameron can probably speak more to it, is we're trying to give the option for you to include those. It's not a mandate, but we're trying to give the local option for you to be able to address some of those items for each of your different unique neighborhoods.
Matt, can I jump in there real quick? Because I think this really is an important point. The framework of this bill, rightly or wrongly, was the legislature saying we're stepping into this space legally. And so as they stepped into the space, that by definition preempts local governments. As a result, we tried to backfill the space by saying there are a variety of tools that cities need in order to protect the property rights of the neighbors and to ensure the quality of life of the residents who are in these internal ADUs. And so we went back and forth for weeks trying to figure out what needed to be essentially put back in the bill to give you the flexibility to regulate if you saw fit. And parking's a perfect example. You may have some communities where, per Soren's point, they may not want to require an additional parking stall. And that under HB 82 is that's your legal right as the city to say we're not going to require additional parking. The number one piece of feedback we got from the league members during the course of negotiations and the surveys we did at LPC and otherwise was about parking and the impacts of parking on neighborhoods. So that's why that was one of the tools that was a must-have for us, so that if you're a city that has those challenges, you may require that additional parking stall, but you're not obligated to do so. So it restores some of that local flexibility that would otherwise have been lost under the original version of the bill. So hopefully that helps. I see other questions, and Meg, I'll turn it back to you and Angela and Victoria and Wolf to navigate the questions, but I just wanted to chime in on that piece.
And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take two more, which I'm just making the executive decision that I think they're global, and we'll try to, like I said, this is our first stab at this, and I know we're going to be unearthing lots of questions. So we'll take a stab at another document that tries to answer these. We're also going to have that 4-hour deep dive in May, and we're going to talk about this again in April. So please don't despair if I didn't get exactly to your question, but I think this is a good one globally. Would this bill now legalize all illegal ADUs?
No, I don't think it does. I think what it does do, and I think there's a question too about what do you do with illegal ADUs. I think, first step is set your parameters of what you're allowed to do for the IADUs, and then require people to come in and apply for those. And that includes those who have existing illegal IADUs. They would come in to apply to make them legal essentially, and they would have to comply with what your ordinances are in place in order to be approved.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I think, that's one of the biggest struggles that so many cities have, right? Is we have all of these illegal ADUs that certainly have, some health safety concerns and whatnot. And so in theory, this could open up the door for a municipality to say, okay, we're going to have this period where we, adopt this internal ADU ordinance, and we're going to have this period where we allow people to come in and apply for internal ADUs and get legal. And so there could be some opportunities within cities to really leverage this as an opportunity to tackle those problems that we have within cities of copious amounts of illegal ADUs, and really kind of understanding what those are and working through a process to allow them and get them licensed.
Great. And then again, thanks, Shawnee, clarified. We'll see in the chat box. Again, thank you all for answering some of these questions as we go. That back to the short-term rental, as Victoria said, you can prohibit that. So I'll try to continue to answer these, but we're going to move on because that is just bill 1, and we are already 45 minutes into it. So you can see how we want to get through our top 3. Angela, I'm going to have you move on to 98, but we'll again try to keep answering these. So thank you.
Great, yeah. Thanks. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I would just remind people that part of HB 82 goes into effect in October. So you do have a little bit more time to think through some of these issues than you do on some of these other bills.
Yeah, that's a good reminder, Victoria. And then just a thank you to the team that is in the chat. I see Sean Guzman. I'm sure Gary Crane is in here. So feel free to chime in. I know you guys were in the weeds on working on a lot of this. So feel free if you guys have any additions to do that. And thanks to those answering the questions in the chat for us. So the next big bill is HB 98, Local Government Building Regulations. And this is Representative Paul Ray's bill. Essentially, this bill, kind of the high level, does a couple things. It changes the rules for building inspections, plan reviews. It details what a complete building permit application is. Now, this is different than a land use application in LUNMA, and it prohibits the ability to regulate some design standards. This was a bill that we saw in the 2020 session. I remember Wilf and I talking about this down in Moab last year and how we were hoping that it would die on the sword and not come back to life, but it came back with a vengeance this year. And I would be doing us all a disservice if I didn't give a huge shout out to Gary Crane and all of his work on this bill. Again, I don't know that he slept much for the first 6 weeks of the session, and was thrown and tarred and feathered many times over this bill and being pulled in many directions. So Gary, if you're on, thank you so much for all of your work on this bill and getting it to the place that we were at now. I want to first start out by pointing out that this bill is specific to single family, duplex, and townhomes. So this does not impact commercial or multifamily. And that's a really important distinction that as you're looking at these different provisions, that you're keeping that in the back of your mind, that this is, again, single family, duplex, and townhomes. So the building review timelines remain the same as set out in the 2020 session, which is 14 days after a complete application is submitted. This bill clarifies that it's business days, not calendar days. So that's a really important distinction, again, to kind of keep in the back of your mind. What this does is it puts forth this provision here. You can see the city, it lays out these criteria in which a city may not enforce a plan review requirement. So if the city fails to meet this first 14-day deadline, the applicant needs to submit in writing that they're requesting for the city to finish the review. That then triggers a second 14-day deadline. If the plans have been stamped by an architect or a structural engineer and the city does not meet these deadlines and these criteria outlined here, then you cannot enforce your plan review requirement. So this is a really big deal. Obviously, you want to be able to review plans of what's being built within your jurisdiction. So it's so important that you're tracking and watching those shot clocks on these 14-day deadlines. And I'll get into this a little bit more in a minute on the 3-day deadlines and what a complete application is. Again, it also doesn't, it permits a plan resubmission, or it allows a plan resubmission if there's a third-party review and deficiencies are identified in geotechnical or geological reports. And I know there's some nuances here. Victoria, do you want to get into that 15% slope thing, or should we hold off on that till another time and date?
I would just say that the plan review can have a geotechnical report. The limitations on the slope are only as they're described in there. So it's not that you can't have a geotechnical report for things only for slope. You can have geotechnical reports for other things. There's just qualifiers on the slope.
Yeah, and again, we give you kind of our hot take assessment here, but always encourage you to read these bills and dive into the details and get the nuances, because this is just sort of the high level review. Meg, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. Oh, sorry,
Yeah,
go ahead.
just a reminder, those summaries, we provided a link to each of the bills and some of this in more detail. Yeah, next one, and then we have some questions.
Okay.
Of course.
I think one of the biggest changes and challenges with this bill, and I know within Salt Lake City, we have a lot of concern about this provision, but essentially what the next piece that this bill does is it says, if you do not meet the 3-day inspection deadline, now this is only if you don't meet those deadlines, the developer can hire a third-party doppel inspector that's insured to conduct their own inspection, and they have to issue the certificate of occupancy. So it is incredibly important that you meet those 14-day thresholds for plan review and these 3-day inspection thresholds, so that you don't have these third-party inspectors coming in, inspecting on behalf of a developer and issuing those COs within your city. And maybe as a city, you decide that works for you and the bandwidth that you have within your municipality. But this is a really, really important provision for your building departments to know, for your planning departments to know that these shot clocks trigger, and it's important to follow those within your cities. Meg, do you want to go to the next slide? Do you guys have anything else you want to add to that piece? No? Okay.
We will be posting another summary that we've had some building inspectors do for us that are more detailed on this, just that'll be coming.
Yeah, thanks, Meg. The other provision is it details what a complete application is. And I encourage you, again, to take a look at the bill and see what those kind of checklist items are. We just pulled out a few things that seem relevant. Specifically, if you can't require elevations anymore unless it's new construction. You can look at defensible space if it's required by the Utah Wildland Urban Interface Code. And again, just highlighting that this is a complete application checklist for a building permit, this is different than a complete application, which is outlined in LUDMA. So it's important for you to take a look at those provisions and making sure that as you're entitling property projects within the planning division, that what you're requiring as you go into the building permit phase is allowed under this new statute. The other thing that kind of came up quite a bit was as when the shot clock starts. And so I got this directly from one of my staff in Salt Lake, who was pretty heavily involved in this bill, and his interpretation, which Victoria or Meg, if you have any different interpretation, let me know. But essentially, once that checklist is complete and a payment is received, the city then starts your review process to make sure that it's a complete application. I'm sorry, once the checklist is complete, once the checklist is complete, payment is received, you can start that internal review. The shot clock does not include this pre-screening process. So what I would say would be a helpful thing to do is have within your application process that checklist, so you have that documentation that you can give to the developer that says, here are the 30 things that I need to see within this type of application. And once you've met all 30 things on this list, and I determine that you've met all of those requirements, I accept your payment, and now that shot clock starts for the 14 days review or the 3-day inspection. So it's important to, I think, be transparent and communicate what that checklist is, so that, you know, being a planner, I know oftentimes we would get back of the napkin site plans, and we'd have to interpret what that is. And you certainly deal with different skill levels. So I think having that really outlined on your application process and having that checklist that's directly from state code that aligns with these single family duplex and townhomes will save you having to argue that shot clock time with applicants. So with that, unless you guys have anything else to add, I will kick it off to my partner in crime, Wilf, to take us through the design piece, and the king of LUDMA himself to go through the changes there.
And I think I'm going to do a timeout because while we're on this, we have a lot of questions, and I think we also are trying, I think Carson's going to unmute our friend here, Gary Crane, if he wants to weigh in. But we've had, if you check the chat, there's a lot of questions that have been answered about time frame and the shot clock period, but I'm wondering if we review that one more time on this, because I think that seems to be one of the global questions. And then just to reiterate, under the complete application definition, Gary qualified there that means you can't ask for more, and Victoria as well, you can't ask for more items, and that seems to be another answer there.
Yeah, Gary, are you in? Do you want to talk about the shot clock piece?
Sure. I kind of blipped out a little bit while you unmuted me, but the shot clock, the whole purpose of coming up with a completed application was to keep both sides honest, so to speak. There was a situation, there's been several situations where cities have refused to accept applications primarily based on the fact that they refused to come up with the amount of the fee, the total amount of the fee. And so the application was delayed, and the 14 days didn't begin. So that was on their side, a complaint on their side. On our side, we wanted to make sure that we knew exactly when the trigger would be pulled for the 14-day period. And if we can check all of those items off the list, and you're right, the pre-period of putting all that information together is not included within the 14 days. Just like in the planning section or LUDMA, a completed application, you remember the ripcord provision, you only count from the time when the city has accepted a complete application. And here we decided to go ahead and define what a complete application was. Any of the preliminary work in putting that together is not included in the 14 days. And then the 14 days begins to run. And I did want to make it clear too, that as confusing as it may seem, that second 14 days is not at the option of the city, it's at the option of the builder. So you know, if we haven't completed the review within 14 days, the builder can come back and say, don't worry about it. That gives us another 14 days to be able to dig into those things. It's not the city saying, hey, I haven't got it finished, and then going ahead and taking another 14 days.
Hey, Meg, I saw some clarification on the shot clock that I think would be helpful to have Gary weigh in on as well. So Gary, hopefully you're still in. So if one of the, and sorry to usurp your question, but I think this is a really, or you're moderating, I think this is a good one. If there are issues with the plans, so we have a complete plan set, but they don't meet code, does that stop the shot clock?
Okay, so the plan has to meet code. Nothing in here gives a builder the right to build a building that does not meet code. The 14 days shot clock is just simply to prohibit the delay of getting a plan reviewed. It is not intended to circumvent the any ordinance or statutory provision. It's not a free ride, in other words. And so does it stop the shot clock? It may not stop the shot clock, or it may not stop the clock, but what it does do is it prohibits them from proceeding forward until that issue, in other words, to building permit, to building inspection, until they get that item fixed or reviewed or whatever. So the answer is, I guess, unclear. But I think what is clear is that you cannot use the 14-day period and the limitations there to say, well, you know what, you require this size beam in a house, but I think we can get away with this size beam, and it's been 14 days, so we're going to go ahead and proceed forward, because the application would actually be stopped at the building permit level. If there's a red line on the plan or something on the plan that indicates that this requirement was not met, the building inspector would then catch it, and the plan would be stopped. The progress on the building would be stopped. The building inspector does still have every right to stop construction, to red tag a home that is not meeting code or does not meet code. It does not waive any of the requirements in order to extend that time period. Should not be read to extend or to waive any of the requirements of state code or building code.
Okay. So again, we have lots of questions, and I at this point, it's sort of one, and we have a lot more we wanted to get through. We will try to answer all of these. And we're just thinking out loud how to do that. And we will post the chat along with this. But as anticipated, we knew this would generate a lot of questions. So give us some time to try to figure out how to put a response together on these, and we'll try to get that information out to you. But I am going to see if we can just move along, Will, and generate some more questions on the rest of these bills.
Okay, excuse me, I'll just briefly touch on this. As Angela mentioned, this bill was actually submitted in last year's legislative session and did or proposed a lot of the same things that were ultimately passed. It was put on hold primarily for the building permit and the plan check part of it, while the league did a survey to check and see if indeed the time requirements were not being met. The survey from the league showed that largely, very large majority, upward of 95% of the jurisdictions were meeting the time requirements, which we all thought would mean that that means the bill wasn't going to come forward, but it did anyway. So there was obviously some intent there to go ahead with some of this. Another part of that bill, besides the plan check and inspection parts of it, had to do with design standards and regulation of design of residential buildings. The sponsor was looking at bills, similar bills that had been proposed and passed in Arkansas and a couple of other states. And the basic premise of it is that one of the things that adds to the cost of housing, where we have a housing affordability crisis, is design requirements from the local governments. And so the original bill proposed prohibiting any kind of design regulation of residential buildings, period. That was how it was initially proposed. That was then subsequently modified and was made to stated to apply only to single and two-family dwellings and to townhomes. That's where it is now. That a local jurisdiction cannot adopt building design regulations for those types of structures, with a number of exceptions. And again, those exceptions were negotiated in. And they're listed on the screen here for you. You can take a look at those. I won't go over all of those in the interest of time, but you can see there what those are. And those were specifically negotiated in as the discussion occurred. Just a little bit of an editorial comment again. This is, to me, why it's so important to have these discussions on these bills during the interim, because of the details that always seem to get overlooked, or unintended consequences that come about from them. That's a process that has been done with the Land Use Task Force in the past. That process doesn't seem to be working real well right now. And you can really see that from the number of bills that were introduced in this session and the types of things that they did or proposed to do. Both bills that passed and bills that didn't pass. So that's what we've got at this point. I'm sure there's going to have to be some clarification. Another thing that this bill does with regard to design guidelines is that there was an option that was adopted last year in the affordable housing bill to list as one of the options for moderate income housing plans as an element to enhance affordability, was with regard to limiting or restricting design guidelines or design standards for homes. That option has been removed by this bill. So that is no longer one of the options that's in there to be considered, because the basic assumption of this bill is that you're not allowed now to adopt design guidelines for 1 and 2 family structures and for townhomes. So that basically is what came out of this bill on the design guidelines. Just to move on again, as we did with the last bill, and we'll do with some of the other bills here. Again, this requires some things to happen, or you need to take a look at doing within your jurisdiction if you work for a local government. You need to look at revising your moderate income housing plan, particularly if you select it as one of those options, the design reduction menu item. So you need to go back and take a look at that and make some modifications and choose a new option, because you're required to have a minimum number of options. And again, review your zoning and subdivision regulations, see if you have design standards in there, and make sure that they comply with what this new code now requires. You're not completely prohibited. There are circumstances under which you can adopt design guidelines, particularly in ordinance form, in like the plan development or some of the other optional overlay zones, in order for someone to get more density. So you may need to take a look at that. If you don't have those in there now and you would like to have those in there, or you think it's a good idea, you'll need to include those so that you're more specific about that. But make sure that you're addressing them appropriately under the prohibition that's now in place under this bill in the rest of your ordinance. And then, of course, on the administrative side, all of the building code, building inspection, and the plan check provisions that are now adopted, you need to make sure that you're in compliance with those. Angela, anything to add there? Okay, let's, and Meg, if you have anything else on questions or anything.
Yeah, just a couple of questions on that. So the first one is, the moderate income housing plans still are the 82 cities at this point that this applies, that applies to. That was not expanded. And then we have a question here. Does the prohibition on regulating location of garage doors prohibit cities from requiring alley loaded garages? Angela's saying no.
Yeah, I would say not.
It's two. Okay.
But again, check with your city attorney and how he looks at those provisions in the code.
Yeah,
So
so
the
what-
bill,
Specifies rear loaded is not included.
right. Rear loaded was expressly excluded, so.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay. And then for form-based codes, can we have, design material standards in a form-based codes for for townhomes in form-based code ordinances?
The ordinance, I don't think specifically addressed form-based codes, so I think you probably do need to treat it kind of like under the other provisions. But in that case with a form-based code, I think if you do allow for increased density for someone following a form-based code over and above what your normal underlying zoning may allow, then yes, you could include design guidelines. But I think only if you do allow for increased density.
Yeah, I think there's a provision in there for overlay districts, development agreements, and PUDs. So I think that's kind of a gray area, but an interesting perspective. Gary, do you have any thoughts on that? I would agree with Will's interpretation, but we're not lawyers.
Yeah, well, and again, I think it says for those PD and overlay zones, if they allow for increased density.
Yes, and there was a little bit of confusion because the intent was to limit this to single family and duplexes. And then there's that little addition that says and townhomes. It did not mean, if you read it together, really what we're talking about is single family and duplex, either homes or townhomes. And we're not talking about anything over a duplex is subject to all of your requirements. It would count as multifamily and it is expressly excluded by these provisions and was not intended to be covered by these provisions.
So two more, and then we'll move on to the next, well, how many more bills do we have? But just a clarification, is a minimum square footage a design guideline? And I would say no, but.
Yeah, I mean, I would say no, but boy, somebody might get creative on that.
Yep. And then if Cameron's still with us, I want to have him just tackle this one globally because there's a question from Mike here about, has there been any thought to having the effective date of land use bills be extended to review, understand draft, and then push all these changes through the planning commission and council is going to be a Herculean task. And we hear that, and I'd like Cam to, that is definitely something that was talked about. So I'll have Cam talk to that point.
Yeah, thanks, Meg. It's a great question. And frankly, all of these questions have been terrific. Carson on our team is gathering all of them for the FAQ. And then I've answered a few individually here while the panelists have been speaking. We were successful in House Bill 82 with a delayed effective date for that very reason. So as to give enough time to work through the process. And my hope is that if there are going to be future land use bills that have to follow that local process, that the model we've used in House Bill 82 could be a model that we use elsewhere. That being said, I think the bigger point is, and stop me if I'm going in a different direction here, is that we want to track this year how much time and effort municipalities have to utilize to comply with these massive changes in land use law. We provide fiscal notes on every bill that comes through the legislative cycle that impacts local governments. But the way that fiscal note process is designed is that we'll get notice that the bill is public, and then within a matter of hours, we have to provide a fiscal note. So we have a handful of cities that we will rely on, and then we internally as staff will try to figure out what the fiscal impact could be of bills. And that's an easier thing to do on short notice when you're dealing with revenue. It's at this point basically impossible to do when you're talking about the impact and the burden on cities to comply and meet the timeframes and really divert staff from other work that you're doing in the planning space. So we've chatted with a handful of cities, including your legislative co-chairs, about whether we should develop some sort of template to help us accurately track the fiscal impact of these bills on you as staff and on your planning commissions and otherwise, because every minute that you spend complying with these new mandates, that's a minute that you're not spending implementing your general plan, working on rezones, processing, and doing other things in your community to accommodate population growth and plan for your communities. So stay tuned on that. That's something that we plan to follow up with not just the planners, but with city managers and with elected officials as well. And again, trying to reframe how we talk about land use at the Capitol. Meg, did that hit it? Is there anything else you want me to touch on while I've got the floor?
I think that's great. Yeah, so point not unrecognized. We understand the
Yeah.
time and effort taken. All right.
Perfect. And in fact, Meg, one of my former debate teammates from high school agreed with me in the chat box. So I appreciate that, Josh. We will stay on top of this one.
Excellent. Okay, we've got 15 minutes left and we respect your time. We also respect the complexity and questions on this. So please do not feel like because we're going to end in 15 minutes means that this conversation is done. We will continue to get you information and resources as we navigate this. We want to quickly go over 409, Wilf, and then maybe we'll just quickly, you all have an access to the slides. You all have the summaries. So you have the other bills, but these are the top three because of the ramifications and the timing. So let's hit 409 and see how we do, Will.
Yeah, I think let's hit 409, and then we have listed all of the other bills. They're in the slides and they're also in the written materials. And we may just have to leave you to look at those on your own, because a lot of other bills passed and also didn't pass. And those are things that you need to be aware of as well. At least they're more specific, but let's go over this. 409 is the actual Land Use Task Force bill. Wow, a bill that the Land Use Task Force actually had some input on and developed. Not all of the Land Use Task Force, not all of it. Stuff was added to this bill very late in the session. Gary Crane and I had some conversations about what was going on, and the whole Land Use Task Force didn't get a chance to look at all of these provisions, which means there were some things in there that they probably would have been different had we had the whole Land Use Task Force looking at them. Well, let's go over what they are. All of the various things are listed here. I won't go over them individually. We're going to hit on them as we go through some of the other slides. The ones that we don't have additional slides on that I just want to touch on quickly. This bill does define the term substantial evidence. You probably are all aware that as you make decisions, land use decisions, administrative decisions, the standard, and particularly in the appeals process that's to be used is there substantial evidence for the action that was taken? That's a term of art from my understanding in the legal community, but a lot of other folks didn't know what that meant. And so this bill actually now defines what substantial evidence is, kind of to indicate what that standard is that relates to making land use decisions. So it's there. It also has language in it that stipulates that the standards for conditional use permits or for conditional uses are to be objective. I put that in the duh category. No kidding. They should be objective, but apparently there were those in the development community and elsewhere that felt like that needed to be explicitly stated. So it's there now, saying that your standards must be objective. It also stipulates, again, another duh thing, I think, but I guess I'm probably just too close to it and assume these things are well known, that it specifies that the enactment of a land use law is not subject to an appeal authority. So really your adoption of your general plan, the land use law, your ordinances, your codes, and your zoning and rezones. Some, I guess, have felt like that those things can be appealed to the appeal authority. They are not. They're legislative actions and are not subject to the standards of the appeal authority. And so that's just made more clear in there. Okay, other provisions now we want to talk quickly about. Meg, if you go to the next slide. So the first one is This has been talked about for a few years now. It finally has been enacted in this bill. Planning commissioners will be required now to receive annual land use training. They are required to receive, they will be required under this bill. Oh, let me say first, there's a caveat to that. Not all planning commissions, only those in communities of a specified size and in counties of a certain size are those required to have receive this land use training. The idea there being that those larger communities and larger counties are those that are seeing the most development activity, and they're the ones that will be put under this requirement. So in those communities, the planning commissioners will be required to see 4 hours of annual land use training. One of those hours must be on the general powers and duties of LUDMA. So basics on that Meg does so ably with her annual or her seminars that she usually holds a few times throughout the year. That's not the only source where you can receive those. The bill does also indicate that that can be done at the local level by your own staff, assuming that they do have some basic knowledge of land use. And so that can be handled in a variety of different ways, but they must receive 4 hours of training, 1 hour on the basics, and 1 hour of training time can be counted for attending at least 12 planning commission meetings in a calendar year. Kind of an interesting provision, but that's there and that counts. Other categories of land use training that are beyond the basics of LUDMA are suggested in the bill, and these can be met in a variety of ways by attending conferences, seminars, the trainings that the League and APA do, and also by your own staff in-house. That will count. That can count as well. You just need to make sure that you document that and keep that in hand. Now, the bill also does specify that new planning commissioners cannot participate in a planning commission meeting until they have received at least that 1 hour of basic training. So that's a minimum. When you get a new planning commissioner that's appointed now, they must get that 1 hour of basic training, and then they can participate in the planning commission meetings. Meg, any questions on that or any additional information? Okay, let's go on. There were a bunch of provisions in this bill that were related to subdivisions and to parcel lot line adjustments. The parcel lot line adjustment stuff is extensive. There's quite a bit of information in there. And it really, you know, we are really, the LUDMA sections of the code are really starting to get big. There's a lot of stuff in there now. It's not simple. And the parcel and lot line adjustments part of that is a big part of that now. So I won't take the time to go over all of those provisions here. Just be aware of those. On the subdivision side of it, it does require that a subdivision must identify and preserve easements for culinary water and sanitary sewer. Apparently there was some problem with that, so that must be done now. And then there's a provision now, and this is one of those things that I indicated came about after the Land Use Task Force had a chance to deal with this. When some of the members of the Land Use Task Force tried to deal with it in the middle of the session as best they could. It's based on a number of different concerns and things that were expressed to them. But when a subdivision is recorded now, on that recording date for 10 years thereafter, for building permits that are applied for in that subdivision, you can no longer apply any new land use ordinances or regulations that you may have enacted subsequent to the date of the recording of that subdivision. I've heard from a lot of folks that are saying that is going to be an administrative nightmare to try and keep track of that. But nonetheless, it's there. So you will now need to be aware of the dates of the recordings of the subdivisions and what your subsequent land use regulation enactments are, and keep track of what you can apply and what you cannot apply in each individual subdivision based on those factors. Anything else to add there from others, or are there any questions, Meg?
I think we're good to keep rolling. for
Okay,
right
let's roll on. I know we're pressing up against time. This bill also adds a section to the LUDMA about development agreements. There's been a lot of activity about development agreements in the last couple of years, particularly with a couple of referenda that occurred and then court cases as to just what does a development agreement entail and what does it mean. And so the clarification for that has been put into this. This was discussed by the Land Use Task Force, but the section now defines what a development agreement is. It says that if it conflicts with the development agreement conflicts with the land use regulations, that development agreement then must go through a legislative process. In other words, you can't just administratively override a local ordinance or code. You can do it if it is done, the development agreement is adopted through a process similar to the process that you have in place for adopting or amending land use regulations. So that's required. It also stipulates that the agreement that requires the enactment of a land use regulation is considered to be administrative and so therefore is not subject to a referendum. So it's just trying to indicate what is and what isn't subject to a referendum in these development agreements. And it also indicates that in your community, you cannot make a development agreement the only option available to develop land. There must be some by right types of way that land can be developed, not only through development agreement. Okay.
Okay, and I'm going to jump one back because this is another one of those unearthed consequences of legislation. And I know Gary's still with us, but or if Ryan's on the phone as well. Anyone, we've had some questions here about that subdivision provision.
Right.
About the 10-year limit. And we've had, is the 10-year limit on land use regulations retroactive or just for new subdivisions and dealing with the effective date? And then do we need to flag subdivisions again since 2011 or just going forward? So some clarification on that might be helpful.
You know, if Gary's still on with us, and I think he is, I'd throw that to Gary or Ryan if he's there, one of the two of you, if maybe just indicating. I think it's not retroactive, but I don't know that for sure. Gary, can you clarify for us?
Yeah, I agree. Well, generally new land use law is not retroactive unless it deals specifically with a health or safety issue of some sort, and the court has extended coverage of new legislation to those issues that might arise in that area. But this does not deal with that, and so it would only be going forward is the way that I read it.
Okay. All right, and then let's talk about there is a provision, a section in there that deals with, it's labeled as roadway improvements now that's been added to the LUDMA, but it really is specific to roadway improvements in a required low impact development. Low impact development is something that is related to stormwater and how stormwater is dealt with. And so this provision has been now added to say that there are requirements as well for what can be required for roadway improvements within those low impact developments for stormwater. You can't exceed a roadway width of 35 feet. And you have some infrastructure improvement standards for fire access and turnarounds. So what this really means, again, what you need to do, you definitely will need to go back, those of you in local government, you definitely will need to go back and update your subdivision code with regard to definitions and a number of provisions in there, certainly for lot, line, and parcel boundary adjustments. Review and update your conditional use standards to make sure that they're objective, and also whatever you may have in place, and you may want to enact some provisions regarding development agreements. And then make sure, of course, in your administrative processes that you're now going to be following these new requirements.
So 2 questions. First of all, just on a clarification on the right of way, and I know Mark Stratford dealt with this, but the 35 feet applies to pavement width or right of way. So anyone want to?
I'd have to take a look at the language in front of me, and if Mark's there or if someone knows, please chime in.
I'm looking it up right now. I'll chime in a second.
Okay, and then one more to just reiterate, yes, this recording will be available on the LEAD website, the APA website, along with all the supporting documents, and then that's also where we'll try to post answers to these questions as we work through them. But I would want to just get clarification on the, back to this subdivision changes provision from Judy, saying that the changes are quite extensive. Landowners may now subdivide property without input from the municipality if they make 3 basic claims. Requiring future approvals, does not include any approvals, and does not have approval from the city. Has any thought been given to the impact of that change? And I know Sean's on here. I don't know if Gary wants to touch that one, or Victoria. Any clarity we can lend to that question? Well, I guess.
Okay, now I am unmuted, Meg.
Yeah,
not
there
sure
you
that
go, Sean.
Okay, thank you.
It's on the line.
Okay, I'm not sure that I understand the question entirely, so I'm wondering if it has to do with the new agreements regarding property lines, and is that what it is? I wonder if someone could clarify that for me.
Carson, I don't know if you can find Judy and she can speak to it directly. We can unmute her if you can help me navigate that.
And as we're doing that, I will say that prior to this, the existing statute allows people to do the boundary line adjustments and agreements without any input at all from the cities. This change here kind of clarifies that if one of those properties is in a subdivision, if it's a lot in a subdivision, they still have to do an amended plat, and that's clear in this change. But if it's between 2 properties that are not in a subdivision, then they can do as they can do now, execute an agreement and split those properties without any input from the municipality, unless there is a dwelling unit on one of those. And if there is, then I would suggest all of you look at this code, because it requires you as a city to adopt an ordinance that states that if there's a dwelling unit on one of those properties, they have to come to you to get approval.
Okay, great. And there are lots of Judys apparently on us, so good to you, Judy's. But Judy clarified, and she's talking about the definition of subdivision is what she was concerned about. And then we do have another subdivision question that will sneak in.
What was the question on subdivision again, Meg? What was the question about it?
About the definition. What,
Yeah.
what specific?
465. And we'll try to get to that, Sherry, maybe in the frequent, as we follow up on trying to address all of these more in
Yeah.
depth. But there was another question from Sherry about what if the land use change benefits the owner? And I guess I'm not sure, I've lost where her original question was, if somebody wants to.
I wonder if she was the one who made the comment or question on the 10-year prohibition on any changes, that if the property owner comes in and I guess rezones it, or if that change that's been made subsequent in the 10 years is a benefit. Let's say that, for example, you've reduced the setback requirements and the property owner wants to take advantage of those new requirements. I believe we talked about this internally, that it's up to each jurisdiction to decide if they're going to do that or not. And the presumption is that if we've changed the setbacks, for example, we see that as a beneficial change, and we most likely would say, yeah, you can take advantage of that beneficial change.
Okay, and we'll follow up on that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so we have exactly 0 minutes left, but
Right.
I think we're going to do a speed. For those of you that are with us, we're going to just speed through these slides, and we'll just say, look for HB 107, look for SB 201, and we have a guideline for clerks on the actual statute sections, thanks to Gary and the clerks on that can help you navigate. Agricultural land use regulations, voter referendum amendments, impact fee amendments, some other county specific bills that passed, and then more bills that passed are all here. We didn't go in depth, but they're on the summary. And then I'm going to let Victoria, who was our lead lady through the legislative session here, talk about interim issues, and then we will conclude today's session for you. But please take heart. We will have more information. We'll have information at our April conference. Again, a 4-hour deep dive in May with APA. Victoria, you want to wrap it all up in one neat button for us here?
Well, it's not going to be a neat button, but I will do it quickly, which is there were 2 billboard bills this session. What I would recommend is if you have not revisited your sign ordinances lately, especially in light of some recent US case law on-premise and off-premise signs, I would definitely look at your sign ordinances. Utah Lake Authority, there's an effort to try and revitalize the lake, but the bill that did not pass this session would create kind of a new political subdivision authority and try and get those communities around the lake looking at some land use, some tax increments, some other things. So we're expecting something else to come up from that. Fees, I would say that fees will definitely come back this year. There is feeling at the legislature that cities are not really closely examining their fees and that they may not be charging a fee that is comparative to the actual service rendered. And this may dip into impact fees as well. We've already discussed short-term rentals, inclusionary zoning. That is something that the Commission on Housing Affordability talked a little bit about, and then last minute threw into a bill and then fortunately took back out because it's a complicated issue, but we're expecting more discussion on that. And finally, the Property Rights Coalition wants to revisit PIDs, public improvement districts. They find this as a helpful tool to invest in infrastructure. Our concern is always that the local government that will eventually take over these improvements and have taxing authority impacted by PIDs be involved. But there's probably going to be some legislation or effort this year to expand PIDs. Whether or not they include local governments remains to be seen. So it's going to be easy peasy summer, nothing going on here, but we're going to keep working on these issues and see where they take us. Thanks, Meg.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you to the League Army. It takes an army to get through these. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Utah APA. We have more information to come. And
Meg, can I add one last thing?
you can send us off with the end, Cameron.
Oh, I don't need to, I'll let you send it off, but we value your expertise and input as planners. We have a small staff here at the League. We have 9 full-time employees that handle all of our advocacy and training. Some of you have planning departments that have more staffers than that just within your department. And so we value our partnership with APA, and we need your input throughout the interim about how these bills are being implemented. And if and when practical challenges arise, we want to know about them so we can bring them back up to legislators. Likewise, Victoria referenced all of those big issues that are still coming. We want your input now on those types of issues, because that will help us either on the negotiation side, or when we say, like we did on the fees bill this session, there is no room to negotiate. This bill is unacceptable as is, and we were ready to go down with the ship on that fees bill, and we were successful at defeating it in committee. Finally, I mentioned the engagement concept we've been discussing with your leadership at APA and with our board of directors, and we think there is a tremendous opportunity for you as planners to help your elected officials, both mayors and council members and legislators, understand the value of planning. It is remarkable to us how few legislators came from local government, which means they don't have the background of all of the work that you do at City Hall to make a positive difference for your residents, both today and tomorrow. So we'll be working through this cities work concept. That's our hashtag, is hashtag cities work, so that we can partner with you and you can be a resource for your mayors and council members and legislators to tell the story of how you're planning for the needs of today's and tomorrow's residents. We have additional Wednesday webinars. Land use is just one of multiple issues that we were working on during the session. So next week will be on infrastructure and economic development, which Meg would tell me I'll come back to land use in and of themselves. Then elections and noticing and census, much of which also comes back to land use, and then public safety, the one big issue that Meg, I challenge you to bring back to land use, but I'm sure you could find a way. So those will be each of the next 3 Wednesdays at the noon hour, and then our mid-year conference will be April 21st through the 23rd in St. George. So thank you everybody for your time today and for your insight and your input. Please use Angela and Wilf and league staff as resources, not just to implement these bills, but to lay the foundation for our efforts in the 2022 session and beyond. Meg, I'll turn it back to you.
Nothing more to say. We'll see you in person and virtually as the summer progresses. Thank you.